Okay, we'll get started, I think. So, welcome everyone. My name is James Kennedy. I'm CEO at procurementexpress.com. This is the third in a series of six lectures we have sponsored. And we have, as ever, Kala Dikibo from Telso. Kala is an extremely experienced procurement consultant who helps organizations to improve their procurement processes and implements training for them. And if you're a Procurement Express customer, you also have access to Kala to help you improve your procurement practices. So I'm getting excited because it's a very exciting topic this week, which is negotiation. It's funny, when I heard this topic was coming up, a couple of my team members and customers and so on all chipped in with their own view on what negotiation was and how you go about it. And no one gave me the same answer each time. Everyone had their own different view. So we can get the gold standard now from Kala, no pressure. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand. There's a little button at the bottom there. If you want to talk yourself, you can put a question in the chat, and we will have people here looking out for your questions, and we'll get those answered as soon as they come in. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Kala for Kala. Thanks very much. Take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. Yeah, as you correctly said, James, this is our third webinar out of 6 scheduled webinars. The previous 2 webinars we've done are on specifications and achieving and driving cost optimization. That was the first webinar. The second one we did last week was on stakeholders and engaging stakeholders effectively. So it follows on that negotiation will be a very good topic to do today. I think, one of the main reasons is that we tend to think of negotiations with just external stakeholders, i.e. suppliers, but negotiations also take place internally as well. So as we talked about stakeholders last week, I think negotiating with stakeholders, be they internal or external, is a good topic. So in terms of fundamentals, what is a negotiation? A negotiation is a process of planning, reviewing, and analyzing used by a buyer and a seller to reach acceptable agreements or compromises, which include all aspects of a business transaction, not just the price. So specifically, the key words here are planning, reviewing, and analyzing. A lot of people think that negotiations are just about being in the room in front of whoever you're negotiating with. This definition highlights the fact that actually a lot of the benefit you can derive from a benefit goes in at the early stage in terms of planning. So it's very important that we plan before we get to a negotiation in terms of who we're negotiating with, what our approach is, and we'll be looking at that today. It's also important to think about reviewing negotiations. So, after the negotiation has taken place, we reflect on how it went and look at things that could be done better, so that future negotiations, we will make improvements and not make the same mistakes again. Finally, another point at the end there is just to say that, look, negotiations are not always about price. There are a number of different options or topics that negotiations can be about. And it's just to recognize that as well. And we'll talk about the various possible outcomes or areas that negotiations can be about. There are 2 major parts to a negotiation, that of content and process. Content refers to what the negotiation is actually going to be about. And invariably from negotiation to negotiation, the content will change. So one negotiation may be about price, another one may be about quality, another one may be about environmental standards, whatever the case may be. On the other hand, we have process. So what process will a negotiation go by? And how will it be managed? And in this sense, we're talking about things such as the agenda. What are we going to talk about? Also in terms of scheduling a negotiation, when is it going to be scheduled for? Is it going to be a one-off negotiation? Is it going to be a series of negotiations? Also, who's going to be in the negotiation? Which is it a high-level negotiation? Is it a middle management-based negotiation? All these will look at the process around the negotiation. So in terms of content, in terms of topics of a negotiation, as we said, price, quality, payment terms is a big area, as well as risk share in a negotiation. There are a number of other topics that we can go into that I'm sure some of you who are involved in negotiations can highlight, but these are 4 key areas that potentially a negotiation can be about. In terms of process, as I said, there's an agenda. Now, an agenda outlines what the negotiation will discuss. It's not uncommon to have a negotiation about what goes into an agenda for a negotiation. As you can imagine, a buyer and a supplier may want different things in the agenda. A buyer may want to talk about price. A supplier probably won't want to talk about price. Approach to a negotiation. How do we go into a negotiation? We'll talk about different outcomes, but just to briefly talk about them, there's win-win outcomes and there's win-lose outcomes. Cultural differences, again, who are we negotiating with? Potentially there may be some cultural differences there around time zones, for example, as well as religious differences. So, for example, it wouldn't be a good idea to schedule a negotiation on a religious day because the other party may not be available for that. Mediums of negotiation, most commonly it's face-to-face, but obviously during the pandemic, virtual mediums have been the going or the norm. Telephone negotiations, as well as email based negotiations. There are obviously advantages and disadvantages of some of them, particularly around using telephone, because you don't get all the benefits of reading body language and things like that. Team size, when we're going into a negotiation, are we going to have a team? Is it just going to be yourself, or is it going to be a number of other people from your organization going into negotiation? Again, there are advantages and disadvantages. Depending on the nature of the negotiation, you may want to go in with a technical expert who can advise in the negotiation. If it's finance related, or if it's quality assurance related, you may want to go with someone who has expertise in that to guide in those areas. And finally, how does a negotiation end? Not all negotiations end in a successful outcome. Some negotiations, both parties agree not to agree. But if you do agree, it's also very important to make sure you both confirm what you've agreed upon. Let's remember that the whole purpose of a negotiation is, to feed into a contract. If you don't confirm at the end of a negotiation what has been agreed, then potentially what finds its way into the contract there may be a misunderstanding between both parties. So at the end of a negotiation, it's very important to close and confirm with the other party, this and this is what we've agreed, and therefore, don't be surprised to see this in the contract when we go ahead to sign it. I think another thing to mention as well is in terms of the process or the content, both parties will have different opinions on, for example, the agenda, what should be discussed, in terms of the team size, in terms of the medium. The other party may want it face-to-face, you may want it, over the phone. Again, there's always a divergence, and it's about agreeing on, or coming to some agreement on that. I mentioned approaches, negotiation approaches earlier. There are two main approaches. However, there are three outcomes. So I'll talk about the approaches first. There's a win-win approach, which can also be called an integrative approach. A win-win approach suggests that both the buyer and supplier go into the negotiation with the intention to make sure they both come out with a win. And in order to achieve that, both parties need to be open and transparent in their negotiations. And by open, I mean laying out what your interests are in the negotiation and asking the other party what their interest in the negotiation is. And by both parties understanding what each other's interests are, then the possibility of reaching a win-win outcome increases, because you can work together, you can brainstorm and find a solution that reaches a win-win outcome. On the other hand, you have a win-lose approach. And as the name suggests, both parties are going in to win at the expense of the other party. And in such an approach, it's almost the opposite of a win-win. You're going in, you're not being open and transparent, you're more guarded about what your interests are, and you're likely to use a lot more bargaining power. So you make the fact that you're a big buyer and you're maybe their only customer, you may use that to your advantage to squeeze them on price, for example, or vice versa. If they're a monopoly supplier and therefore they will want to get their way at the detriment of yours. Either way, in terms of supporting a relationship, an ongoing relationship with your supplier, a win-lose approach is not a conducive approach to support a relationship. So, from a best practice point of view, we would always advise that you go in with a win-win outcome, because it supports an ongoing medium to long-term relationship with a supplier. At the bottom there's also a lose-lose outcome. Now, no party goes into a negotiation wanting to, to lose, but potentially, and this can sometimes happen where both parties compromise, both parties reach an agreement through a compromise, but actually when they walk away, they haven't really got what they wanted. So that can also be referred to as a lose-lose. There's an agreement, but the agreement doesn't meet either party's interests or needs. So that's an outcome which you want to try and avoid, but it is a potential outcome. In terms of a scenario, I have here a scenario about an orange. Two parties want an orange. Now, depending on the approach they use, you can come out with different outcomes. So if the two parties use a win-lose outcome to go in and get this one orange, then what you can expect in the negotiation is both parties trying to use their financial muscle, their size, the fact that the other party needs them more. They'll use that to their advantage to try and gain possession of the orange, and that will work both ways. On the other hand, they could use bluffing tactics. Again, they're not, use deception, and we'll go into some tactical ploys that potentially could be used against you. The bottom line is both parties are trying to get the orange at the expense of the other party, and that delivers a win-lose outcome. Under a win-win outcome, rather than trying to get the orange and at the expense of the other party, under a win-win approach, you go in there and you ask for the interests of the other party as well as your own interest. So if I went into this negotiation and wanted to reach a win-win outcome, the first thing I would do is lay my cards on the table and say, look, I want this orange because I'm an orange juice manufacturer and I need the juice for the orange, to make the orange juice. And then I would ask the other party, why do you want the orange? And it may be that they need the orange because they make vitamin C supplements and they need the peel from the orange to actually go ahead and manufacture the vitamin C supplement. And therefore, potentially, because I only need the juice and I don't need the peel and the other party needs the peel, we can reach a win-win outcome. And that all stems from the fact that the approach we took was to go in and understand the interest, not only to explain our own interest, but to understand the interest of the other party as well. And that potentially leads to a win-win outcome. A principled approach is a win-win outcome approach. And there are 4 pillars to a principled approach or win-win approach. The first thing is to separate the person from the problem. Once a negotiation gets personal, then you allow for emotions to enter into negotiation, and that adds to the difficulty of reaching a successful agreement. Focus on common interests. Last week, we talked about the difference between interest and positions. By focusing on interest and the reason why, you're more likely to reach an outcome rather than focusing on positions. Generate ample options. So it just so happened in the scenario I gave you that it was a perfect fit. One party needed the peel, the other party needed the juice. But obviously in most negotiations, it won't be a perfect fit. The key thing to think about with a win-win approach is to always try and generate options, I should say, which could lead to a potential agreement. So if, using the orange example, one of the options could have been to contact the orange farmer and invest in the orange farm so they can produce more oranges that allow both parties to go away with the oranges. Another option may be to think about, other vitamin C substitutes rather than just the orange peel that the other party could use to still satisfy their need. By coming up and generating as many options as possible, you increase the chances of a win-win outcome. And finally, relying on objective criteria as opposed to subjective criteria. So making sure that you, set out criteria such as, being benchmarked against professional standards or index in terms of prices, that can allow for an objective benchmark in terms of an outcome. Tradable. So again, going back to options, the more options or the more tradables you have, the more chance you have of a successful outcome to a negotiation. If both parties went into a negotiation and only thought about getting price or the price that they want, then potentially you're not going to have an agreement. But if you have or throw in other options onto the table, such as payment terms, length of contract, then potentially one party may be able to give ground on price in return for better payment terms. And that potentially can find a path to a solution rather than just, if you only had one option on the table. So when going into a negotiation, it's very important to try and generate a range of options that you have to trade with, as opposed to just going in with, one option. Because if you go in with one option, the chances of a successful outcome are limited. If you go in with multiple options, then you can trade and bargain those options in order to get a preferable outcome. MIL. So MIL is an acronym for must achieve, intend to achieve, or like to achieve. And MIL is a way of prioritizing tradables. So if I just go back to the slide before, we could decide to say price is a must achieve, payment terms is a intend to achieve, length of contract is a like to achieve. What that means is, as we go into negotiations, we've actually prioritized our tradables. So we know if we don't get price, we'll walk away because it's a must achieve. Payment terms are an intent to achieve. So that's something we're going in to negotiate on. And because length of contract is a like to achieve, i.e., icing on the cake option, we may be prepared to trade the length of a contract in return for getting favorable payment terms. So potentially we come out of the negotiation getting our must achieve, which is price, and getting our payment terms, but not getting the length of contract. But since that was a like to achieve, i.e. an icing on the cake, it's not as important. So we're quite satisfied to get the 2 out of 3. So the main purpose of an MIL is to prioritize options. And by prioritizing options, it allows us to, know when to walk away. And, on that note, must achieve is an option that or a tradable that if you do not get, you walk away from, or you walk away from the negotiation. So if, for example, we say price is a must achieve and we don't achieve price, in other words, the supplier doesn't agree to our price, then we walk away on that. It's important when you walk away that you have somewhere you're walking to. It reminded me of, I don't know if anyone's been on holiday and you go to a market stall and you want to buy a trinket or something, and the seller gives you their best price, $10, and you walk away. And as you're walking away, you hope that the seller will call you back and say, no, I'll give it to you for $9 instead. Now, the reason that's not an effective way to negotiate is because when you're walking away, you actually don't have anywhere you're walking to. An effective strategy for negotiating is to meet other sellers prior to meeting this seller and work out what your baseline price is. So if you've agreed with another seller $9, and this seller you're speaking to will not go below $9, when you're walking away, at least you're walking to another supplier who you've already got a pre-agreed price with. So when you do your must achieves, you must plan what your plan B is. Because it doesn't make sense to walk away from a negotiation if you haven't got a plan B. You should go into the negotiation with a plan B. Yep.
Yeah, no, I mean, it just rings a bell there. Like I heard an acronym, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, BATNA.
Yeah.
Before you go in any time, just think about, well, what can we do? And we were negotiating for a new CRM system this week. Yep. We liked some of their features, but the pricing was really tricky, and I just got annoyed with how the pricing was. They didn't get the sale. We don't have a new CRM. No one wins, Yeah. So actually figuring out what you're going to do in advance, at least having some option going in, gives you optionality. That's I'd say the most important thing.
I think as well, the fact that you go into a negotiation having a plan B or another CRM option that you're likely to go with if this agreement doesn't work, even affects the body language and the way you approach that negotiation. Because when you say to that supplier who you're negotiating with that you're going to walk away, they get a sense that you do mean it and that you do actually have a better offer elsewhere. But if you potentially say you're walking away and you don't have a better offer, they're less likely to come back to you and refine their offer because they think, well, hang on, these guys don't actually have anywhere to go. So I think, yes, you're right. It's good to have, it's a good negotiating strategy to have a plan B, but the added advantage is when you're in the negotiation, you actually know at what point to walk away from the negotiation because it's the point at which your alternative is better. And also your body language, and we'll come on to communication now, but your body language in the negotiation will convey confidence. And that will also put the other party on the back foot in terms of, hang on, they're serious. They will actually walk away and it sounds like they have a better offer. So let's come up with something else. So that too is an advantage. So non-verbal communication, this may surprise you. 7% of communication comes from words said. 38% is paralinguistic factors such as volume, pitch, and tone of voice. And 55% is body language and facial expression. So, you know, if you have a telephone negotiation, for example, potentially you're missing out on 55% of communication conveyed by the other party, and a lot of meaning can come from that 55%. Just examples of body language can be things like obviously your appearance, but also things like mirroring. So nodding your head when someone's speaking, or copying their mannerisms is a positive form of body language. Also, good eye contact as well. Listening is another important area around communication. So yeah, it's important to recognize that, you know, it's not just what you're saying, it's everything else that you're giving off that's important. Now, this area of communication is quite a broad area, but I just thought I'd highlight some of the key areas to think about, but, you know, they're very broad and, you know, we can have individual sessions on each of them actually. Interpersonal skills, so how you relate to the other party, building a rapport, very important. Again, going back to what I said about planning, finding out a bit about the person you're going to be negotiating with. Do you have any personal interest? You may support the same football team. You may, like, let's say, have visited the same country in the past. The benefit of LinkedIn and other social media can give that information. Striking up a personal rapport before you get into negotiations is always a good thing. It's a lot harder to say no to someone you get on with than to someone that you don't have anything in common with. Emotional intelligence, so understanding your own emotions and being in control of your own emotions. Intuition, being able to read the other party's body language correctly, to be able to provide empathy if you need to provide empathy, if you can, that's what your intuition guides you on. Questioning, there are different types of questioning, open and closed questioning, for example. Probing questions if you want to find out more information, as well as hypothetical questions. Now, hypothetical questions are very good in negotiations because you can move a negotiation along once you start adding, well, if we do this, would you be prepared to do that? Because at that stage, they can either say yes or no, but come back with a counteroffer. So using hypothetical questioning can actually move the negotiation towards the closing phase. And then personality. We talked earlier about trying to remove personality from, or remove the person from a negotiation, but people's traits and their characteristics cannot be ignored. Some people are impulsive, other people are introverted. Again, having a good understanding about the other party can, again, help lead to a successful outcome in a negotiation. Okay, earlier I spoke about different types of approaches, win-win and win-lose. As I said, best practice is to go with win-win and a principled approach, so finding out the interests of both parties. However, you may be faced with a supplier who adopts a win-lose approach. And I talked earlier about ploys and tactics they may use, and here are some of the tactics that potentially they could use. So you could have a supplier using the good cop, bad cop routine. I'm sure you've heard of that before, where the supplier sympathizes with you, but says, look, they've got a really tough boss who's not willing to budge. The question is, what do you do if you're faced with that? And the best thing to do is to mirror them, to reply the same thing to them and say, well, actually, I've also got a tough boss who's not moving on me. Sorry, who's not allowing me to move either. And potentially you reach a stalemate and you walk away, but at least you don't get, in quotes, sucked into that ploy. Mother Hubbard is where the supplier says to you, look, we really love doing business with you, but the cupboard's bare. We don't have anything else to offer. That's our final offer. If you're faced with that, reject the offer. You have your MIL, you have your must achieves, you have your intent to achieve, stick to those. And if the supplier is not willing to move, the cupboard's empty and they really like you, etc. If they're still not ready to move, walk away. The Russian front, this comes from the First and Second World War. The Russian front was the worst option for anyone to be posted to the Russian front. And therefore anyone would, any fighter would want to go to another front to fight because at least it wasn't as bad as the Russian front. So the Russian front tactic is where the supplier gives you two options. One of them is very, very bad, i.e. the Russian front. The other one is still bad, but because you think you're getting a choice and you're avoiding the wrong, the worst option, potentially you could be misled into thinking you're getting a good, good outcome when actually you've just chosen the better of two worse options. So if you're faced with that, generate more options. As we said earlier, try and come up with more options to say, well, look, I know you're trying to give me a either or. There are other options we can talk about and put them on the table and see if you can reach agreement there. Otherwise, you've got your BATNA, you walk away and you go to your next best solution or plan B. Snow job is if the supplier, floods you with information and tries to confuse you, and in the process of confusing you, tries to get you to agree to a proposal. If that happens, don't, keep asking questions until you understand what they're talking about. Don't be, in quotes, sucked into, the barrage of information. Keep asking questions until you understand what they're talking about, and then proceed on that basis. And finally, one last thing is where you, at the end of the negotiation, you shake hands, both parts, you've agreed, and that's just as you're walking out the door, the supplier tries to tap you up for one more concession and says, oh, by the way, can you just add in something, etc. If you're met with that, either you reject it and say, no, we stick to the agreement we just shook hands on, or make sure you get a concession back. So agree to it, but say you want something in return of equal value. And it's something to be prepared for. So as I said, these tactics are not something I would advise because they are tactics and they don't promote open, transparent relationships. So therefore, I wouldn't advise it. But if you're faced with such suppliers, that come forward with these tactics, then I think it's only right that you are prepared. And finally, in terms of reviewing a negotiation, when the negotiation comes to an end, it's very important to reflect on how it's gone, to make sure that subsequent negotiations are done better. And there are three core areas that you can look at in terms of the content. So, what did you go into negotiate about? What were your objectives? Did you achieve your objectives? If you didn't, why do you think you didn't? And what can you do differently next time? In terms of the process, again, things around the agenda. Was the agenda set correctly? Did you provide, was there sufficient time to carry out the negotiations, or did you feel rushed? Should you have scheduled out more meetings for the negotiation? And again, this is all with the intention of improving for subsequent negotiations. Finally, people. You may have gone in with a team. Was everybody on message? Did some people, underperform because they hadn't prepared well enough on their particular area that they were supposed to cover? Did you contradict yourself in the negotiation? Were people on the same team speaking over themselves? Again, these are things to reflect on so that next time you don't make the same mistakes and you improve going forward. One last thing to also remember is, at the end of the negotiation, it's also important to think about the state of the relationship after the negotiation. Yes, you may have gone for a win-win outcome. Yes, you may have achieved a win-win outcome, but in some part of the negotiation, there may have been some bad blood between the two parties, and it may affect the long-term relationship. So it's always important to reflect on the state of the relationship after negotiations taking place, and if need be, start putting in some fence mending initiatives to try and build back that relationship if it needs to be built back. But it's worth reflecting on at the end of the negotiation. Right, that is it. Thank you very much. This was a pretty high level look at negotiations. There are lots of areas, particularly around cost strategies, that I'm quite happy to talk to people about if they are, involved in negotiations. Because the subject is very broad, and there are a lot of aspects that one could go into. But if you do have any questions or anything I've spoken about, any clarification, feel free to send me an email or ask away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kala. That was really good. Now, obviously, that was just a quick introduction. We are producing a sort of an online learning portal with more in-depth sort of review of all these topics. It's going to form a six sort of classes over 6 weeks. And that'll be made available at the end of this. So if you've got team members that you want to give a good basic overview of procurement best practices, that portal will be available to Procurement Express customers as well. Also, Kala is available to any customers that are going, or maybe you're going through a tricky negotiation right now and you'd like a second opinion on it, we can hook you up with some time at Kala as well, if that would be of service to you. I'd like to thank everyone for coming along this evening. Maybe, Kala, you can just give us a preview of what's happening next week, next Wednesday. What's the next topic that's coming up?
Yeah, next week we'll be looking at contracts. As I said, negotiations feed into contracts. It's very important that we think about the risks associated with contracts. Most of you may be involved with purchase orders, and to recognize what's at stake when issuing purchase orders. Also thinking about standard terms and whose standard terms will be used, whether it's your standard term or the supplier standard term, and the risks involved there as well.
Great. Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. Be the same time, same bat channel next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I hope you can make it then. All the best.